HBO's new fantasy show will be the solution that saves the traditional fantasy genre. Over the past 16 years, cynical fantasy has taken over TV, pushing traditional fantasy aside. While fantasy and sci-fi have generally been trending in that direction, Game of Thrones is what really cemented the shift away from traditional fantasy. George R.R. Martin's books and the TV show felt like a direct response to the polished, optimistic hero's journey, in which the good go on a quest against evil and eventually triumph. It rejects the notion that good will always prevail. Frankly, it even pushed away the notions of traditional heroes and villains, making even the best characters in Game of Thrones morally gray. In place of sanitized visuals, it offered up intense violence and gritty realism. Unfortunately, Game of Thrones got so popular that it caused a massive shift in fantasy TV shows towards the macabre and cynical. Before, dark fantasy was the niche subgenre and traditional fantasy was the mainstream, but that almost completely flipped the script. Now, I'll be completely upfront here about my bias here. I generally love dark fantasy shows more than traditional fantasy, though I can occasionally get down with a good cozy fantasy book or TV show. I usually lean towards shows with a cynical tone. However, I realize that many people feel the exact opposite. If you prefer your fantasy optimistic, I can imagine it has felt unbelievably frustrating since Game of Thrones caused a wave of pessimistic fantasy and grimdark stories. Luckily, one HBO show is swooping in to save the day. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms is helping save traditional fantasy on TV. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms is more grounded and optimistic than Game of Thrones. There's a certain irony in the fact that George R.R. Martin both created the problem and the solution. The on-screen adaptation of Game of Thrones sparked a wave of doom and gloom fantasy TV shows, and the adaptation of his Dunk and Egg novellas is reversing that trend. What's more, A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms wouldn't be the hit that it is if it weren't for the success of the previous two shows, which means that we're stuck in a bit of a paradox where the problem is also the solution. Be that as it may, A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms feels like the first semi-optimistic, mainstream story in almost a decade and a half, at least when it comes to live-action shows created in Hollywood. The new fantasy show feels like a direct rejection of most things that made Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon so popular in the first place. Rather than focusing on the royal families who are making ordinary people's lives miserable, A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms cast is almost entirely composed of the little guys. Instead of a massive scope, the new George R.R. Martin show feels zoomed in on the characters Dunk and Egg. There's an intimacy that makes it feel less like a political drama and more like a simple hero's journey storyline. This is one of the many reasons why many critics, myself included, have dubbed A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms a cozy fantasy. Of course, the story isn't entirely divorced from the larger Game of Thrones franchise. It still has intense violence at times, and the visuals still lean towards realism. However, humor places bleak seriousness, and a more optimistic worldview replaces the nihilistic idea that nothing matters and everybody dies. The story and characters might still exist in a sucky world, but there's at least some form of hope, which feels exceedingly rare in fantasy shows these days. Given the immediate success of A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, it could very well have the same effect on the larger fantasy genre. We could see a whole new wave of traditional fantasy and cozy fantasy TV shows. What's more, George R.R. Martin shared 12 unpublished stories with showrunner Ira Parker, so the show has enough material to continue for 12 to 15 seasons. It seems unlikely HBO will continue a show for that long, but there's at least potential for A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms to have a long run and a significant impact.